The studio lights flickered as static crackled through the speakers. Margaret Stone's weathered hands gripped the microphone, her 72-year-old voice steady. Despite the chaos erupting around her, outside the broadcast booth, shadows moved past the frosted glass. The jamming signal grew louder, threatening to silence everything. Frank worked frantically at the control panel, sweat beading on his forehead. Emily stood by the door, her body blocking the entrance. This was it. The moment when silence could win, or when the voiceless could finally speak. Margaret leaned into the microphone, her eyes blazing with quiet defiance. They tried to make us disappear. Tonight, we make them listen. Grey Haven sat perched on the Maine coast like a secret kept too long. The harbor town carried the weight of centuries in its weathered docks. And saltbox houses, their painted facades fading under the relentless Atlantic wind. Most tourists passed through without a second glance, chasing the more picturesque villages further north. But Grey Haven had something they did not. It had Margaret Stone. Every Thursday night at 9, the yellow light in the community radio station's second-floor window would glow against the darkening sky. Inside, Margaret settled into her chair, with the practiced ease of someone who had found her calling late in life. Twilight Voices had been on the air for 7 years now. A modest program that gave voice to the elderly residents of Grey Haven and the surrounding towns. She interviewed retired fishermen, former schoolteachers, war veterans, and widows. Their stories spilled out across the airwaves, filling living rooms and nursing home corridors with memories that might otherwise die unspoken. Margaret had not planned to become a broadcaster. She had been a librarian for 40 years, a keeper of other people's stories. When her husband died and retirement stretched before her like an empty highway, she had volunteered at the station on a whim. The first interview she conducted was with a 90-year-old woman who had operated a lighthouse during World War II. Margaret realized then that every elderly person carried an entire world within them. And that world was vanishing one funeral at a time. The town seemed peaceful on its surface. Neighbors waved from porches. The Methodist Church held potluck dinners. But Margaret had learned to hear what was not being said. In the pauses between words during interviews, in the careful way some people avoided certain topics, she sensed an undercurrent of quiet suffering. Elderly residents isolated in homes too big for them. Families that visited less and less. Financial pressures that went unspoken. Grey Haven was beautiful, but beauty could hide many sins. Tonight's guest was supposed to be Harold Finch, a retired postal worker with stories about delivering mail during the blizzard of '78. He had cancelled at the last minute, his voice thin and apologetic on the phone. "I'm not feeling well," he had said, but Margaret heard something else. She heard fear. Margaret had learned over the years that every interview revealed more than facts. It revealed the shape of a life, the weight of secrets, the texture of regret. In the past 3 months, she had interviewed 3 people whose stories haunted her long after the broadcast ended. Emily Cartwright had been a nurse for 35 years at the county hospital. Her hands, gnarled now with arthritis, had once delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying. She lived alone in a 2-story colonial that her late husband had bought in 1973. During the interview, Emily spoke warmly about her son, Michael, who worked in real estate development down in Portland. He visits when he can, she had said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. What she had not said on air, but told Margaret afterward, in the parking lot, was that Michael had asked her to sign the house over to his name for tax purposes. Just a formality, Ma. You'll still live there. That had been 8 months ago. Now Michael was talking about selling, about finding her a nice assisted living facility. Emily had signed the papers because she trusted her son. Now she was not sure she even had the right to stay in her own home. Frank Kowalski was different. 80 years old, built like a tree trunk, he had served in Vietnam and worked as a carpenter for 50 years after that. His hands could still build anything, but they shook now when he tried to thread a needle or button his shirt. Frank lived on veterans' benefits and Social Security, a modest but steady income. He had been lonely since his wife passed, and when Pastor Dale from the New Covenant Fellowship started visiting, Frank had been grateful for the company. Pastor Dale had such a warm smile, such genuine concern. The church was raising money for a mission in Central America. Frank had donated, then donated again. By the time he realized the New Covenant Fellowship was not registered with any denominational body, that Pastor Dale drove a Mercedes and lived in a waterfront condo, Frank had given away nearly $40,000. He told Margaret this story with shame in his voice, as if being lonely was a crime. The Mitchells, Harold and Jean, had owned a small commercial building downtown for 30 years. They rented the ground floor to a bookstore and the upstairs to an accountant. It was their retirement nest egg. Then a development company approached them with an exciting opportunity. Lease the building to us for restaurant space. We'll handle everything. The contract had been 40 pages long, and the Mitchells had not understood half of it, but the company representatives had been so professional, so confident. 6 months later, the restaurant had not materialized. But the company was collecting rent from their original tenants while paying the Mitchells a fraction of it. The Mitchells had hired a lawyer, but legal fees were eating through their savings. Harold was the one who had cancelled tonight. Margaret suspected Jean was too ill for him to leave. 3 stories. 3 different kinds of theft. But Margaret was beginning to see a pattern. The elderly in Grey Haven were not just aging. They were being harvested. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the radio station's front door sometime between midnight and dawn. Margaret found it when she came in to prepare for Thursday's broadcast. Plain white paper, no return address, her name written in shaky blue ink. Mrs. Stone, Twilight Voices. She opened it standing in the narrow hallway, morning light slanting through the dusty window. The letter inside was written on lined paper torn from a notebook, the handwriting uncertain but legible. Dear Mrs. Stone, I listen to your program every week. You give people like me a voice when nobody else will listen. I need to tell my story, but I cannot give you my name. I am afraid of what will happen if they know I contacted you. I am 79 years old. 2 years ago my nephew convinced me to let him manage my finances. He said I was getting forgetful and he wanted to help. I trusted him. He was family. Now I cannot access my bank accounts. My pension checks go to an address I have never seen. I signed papers I did not understand. When I asked questions he got angry. Then he moved me out of my house. He said it was temporary, just while they did renovations. That was 14 months ago. I live now in a room in a house with 4 other old people. We are not allowed to leave without permission. They take our medications and give them to us 1 pill at a time. They read our mail. There is a phone, but we cannot use it alone. I am writing this in secret. If you broadcast this, please do not use my name. But please, someone needs to know what is happening. We are not missing. We are just invisible. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Her hands trembled by the 3rd reading, not from age but from rage. She walked to her office, closed the door, and sat in the silence. Outside, the harbor bells rang 9 times. Fishing boats motored out toward open water. The world continued its normal rhythms while somewhere in Grey Haven, someone was imprisoned in plain sight. She could broadcast the letter anonymously, let the words speak for themselves. That would be the safe choice, the professional choice. But Margaret had not spent 7 years listening to the elderly only to treat them as abstract voices. This was not just a story. This was a human being asking for help. And if she did nothing, she would be complicit in their silence. Margaret pulled out her notebook and began making a list. She would need allies. She would need information. She would need courage she was not sure she still possessed. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was up against. By noon, she had made 5 phone calls. By evening, she had 3 people willing to meet with her. By the time she locked the station door that night, Margaret Stone was no longer just a radio host. She had become an investigator. Margaret convened the first meeting in the back room of Sal's diner on a gray Wednesday afternoon. The lunch rush had ended, and Sal, who had been feeding Grey Haven for 40 years, locked the front door and poured coffee for the assembled group. 6 people sat around the worn vinyl booth. Margaret, Emily, Frank, a retired police detective named Ray Morrison, a young journalist from the Coastal Weekly named Beth Torres, and a social worker named Linda Chen who had driven up from Portland. Ray spoke first. His voice carried the flat authority of someone who had seen too much and believed too little. I worked elder fraud cases for 15 years before I retired. What you are describing is not new. It is industrial. These operations work because they exploit trust and shame. Victims do not report because they are embarrassed or because the perpetrators are family members. By the time anyone notices, the money is gone and the paper trail is deliberately complicated. Beth leaned forward, her notebook open. I have been tracking property transfers in the county for a story on housing costs. In the last 18 months, there have been 23 cases where elderly homeowners transferred property to relatives or LLCs, then moved out within 6 months. That is not normal. That is a pattern. Linda added her perspective from social services. We get calls, but we are understaffed and underfunded. Unless there is visible abuse or a formal complaint, we cannot investigate. And most elderly people will not file complaints against their own families. The system is not designed to protect them. It is designed to process cases. Frank cleared his throat. The church that got me. Pastor Dale. I did some asking around. He has been in 3 different towns in the last 5 years. Always a new church, always targeting seniors, always moving on before anyone organizes against him. He is probably gone from here already. Emily's voice was quiet but firm. My son has not done anything illegal. That is what makes it worse. I signed the papers. I gave permission. The law says I made a choice. But it was not really a choice. It was trust weaponized against me. Margaret spread the anonymous letter on the table. This person describes something more organized. Multiple elderly people in one house, controlled movement, intercepted mail. That is not family exploitation. That is something else. Ray studied the letter. That sounds like an unlicensed care facility or a guardianship scam. Someone gets appointed legal guardian, usually through a compliant judge, then warehouses the elderly while draining their assets. It is legal theft dressed up as elder care. Hard to prosecute, harder to prove. Beth was already typing notes. If we can find the house, if we can identify even one person being held there, I can write about it. Public pressure might force an investigation. Margaret looked around the table at these unlikely conspirators. A nurse, a carpenter, a cop, a journalist, a social worker, and a librarian turned broadcaster. Not exactly a task force. But they were what this invisible victim had. They were all anyone had. The investigation began that afternoon. Beth pulled property records. Ray made calls to old colleagues. Linda contacted Adult Protective Services through unofficial channels. Frank drove through neighborhoods looking for houses that might fit the description. Emily started attending senior community meetings, listening for whispers and complaints. Margaret did what she did best. She talked to people. She visited nursing homes and senior centers. She asked gentle questions and listened to the answers beneath the answers. And slowly, carefully, a picture emerged. Grey Haven had a ghost network of exploitation. Fake charities, predatory lenders, relatives with power of attorney bleeding their elders dry. And somewhere, a house where the invisible were kept. 2 weeks into the investigation, Frank found it. A large Victorian on Sycamore Street, painted a cheerful yellow, with a wheelchair ramp and neat flower boxes. It looked like a care home. But there was no license posted, no business name, no emergency contact information required by state law. Frank watched the house for 3 days. He saw elderly residents escorted outside for brief supervised walks. He saw mail delivered and immediately taken inside by a younger man in scrubs. He saw the look in the residents' eyes. Not confusion. Not dementia. Fear. When Margaret received Frank's report, she knew they had found the place. But finding it and proving what was happening inside were different things. She needed more. She needed testimony. She needed evidence. Most of all, she needed courage to match the desperation of that anonymous letter. The next Thursday broadcast was 3 days away. She had decisions to make. The first warning came subtly. On Friday morning, Margaret arrived at the station to find the front door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but her desk drawers had been opened, papers rifled through. The anonymous letter was still locked in her car's glove compartment, but someone had been looking for something. She called Ray, who came over and examined the scene with a professional eye. "No forced entry," he said. "Either they picked the lock or they have a key. You were making someone nervous." That afternoon, 3 of the station's regular sponsors called to withdraw their support. Hardware store owner Bill Hendricks was apologetic but firm. "I got a visit from some people I do business with. They suggested that Twilight Voices was becoming controversial, not good for the community image. I cannot afford to lose their contracts, Margaret. I am sorry." The other calls were similar. Polite pressure dressed up as business decisions. Margaret called an emergency meeting of the station's board. 5 members, all volunteers, all elderly themselves. They met in the conference room on Monday evening. The board president, a former school principal named Arthur Wells, cleared his throat nervously. Margaret, we have received calls too. People are concerned about the direction your program is taking. Some feel you are stirring up trouble, making accusations without proof. Perhaps it would be wise to return to the original format. Personal histories. Nostalgia. Less investigative content. Margaret looked around the table. She saw good people who were also frightened people. She understood. They had built this station with bake sales and pledge drives. They could not afford controversy. But she also knew that safety was a privilege that not everyone had. Someone out there had risked everything to write that letter. She could not betray that courage with her own cowardice. I understand your concerns, Margaret said carefully. But someone asked for help. If I ignore that, what does this program stand for? We give voice to the voiceless. Right now, someone is voiceless not by choice but by force. I have to see this through. Arthur sighed. Then we cannot protect you. If there are legal consequences, the station cannot be liable. Margaret nodded. I understand. This is on me. Tuesday night, the real threat arrived. Margaret was alone in the studio, preparing notes for Thursday's broadcast. The phone rang at 10:30. She answered expecting a listener call in. Instead, a male voice, calm and cold, spoke without introduction. Mrs. Stone, you have been asking questions that do not concern you. Old people have family problems. That is private business. If you broadcast anything about care facilities or guardianship or family finances, there will be consequences. For you, for your friends, for your little radio station. Do you understand? Who is this? Margaret demanded, but the line was already dead. She sat in the silence, her heart pounding. Fear is a physical thing, she realized. It lives in the body, turns the mouth dry, makes the hands shake. She had not felt this kind of fear in years. Not since the night her husband had his heart attack and she drove 90 miles per hour to the hospital, knowing she would not make it in time. She had survived that fear. She could survive this. Wednesday morning, Frank arrived at the station with a black eye and a split lip. Someone jumped me in the parking lot of the grocery store, he said, touching his swollen face gingerly. 2 guys. They did not want my wallet. They wanted to give me a message. Stop helping the radio lady. I told them where they could shove their message. Frank grinned despite the pain. They hit like accountants. I have had worse. Emily called that afternoon. Her son Michael had shown up at her house with a lawyer and eviction papers. You have 30 days, Ma. We need to sell the house. The market is good right now. She was crying, something Margaret had never heard her do. I thought I had more time. I thought he would change his mind. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room overlooking the harbor. The sun set in orange and purple streaks across the water. Boats rocked gently at their moorings. Everything looked peaceful, beautiful even. But she knew now that beauty was a mask. Underneath, in the shadows, people were suffering. And the machine that caused that suffering wanted her to stop looking, stop talking, stop caring. She thought about canceling the broadcast, protecting her friends, keeping her head down. It would be easy. It would be safe. But then she thought about the letter, about the shaky handwriting, about the desperate hope in those words. Please, someone needs to know what is happening. We are not missing. We are just invisible. Margaret picked up her phone and sent a text to the group. Emergency meeting. Tonight. We broadcast Thursday. No backing down. Within an hour, 5 people sat in her living room. Ray, Beth, Linda, Emily, and Frank with his battered face. They looked at each other and Margaret saw the same thing in each face. Fear, yes. But also determination. They had all been pushed. Now they would push back. Beth spoke first. I contacted the state attorney general's office. They are interested, but they need evidence and testimony. We give them that tomorrow night. Ray added, I have a friend in the FBI. Elder fraud crosses state lines, which makes it federal. Once this goes public, they will have to investigate. Linda said quietly, I put in for Emergency Protective Services review of the Sycamore Street house. It is in the system now. They cannot ignore it after the broadcast. Margaret looked at Emily and Frank. You two do not have to be part of this. You have enough to deal with. Emily shook her head. My son took my house. But he cannot take my voice. Frank touched his bruised eye. I let Pastor Dale take my money because I was ashamed. I am done being ashamed. We are doing this. Margaret felt something shift in the room. They were no longer victims or investigators or scared elderly people. They were witnesses. They were resistance. Tomorrow night, Twilight Voices would become something it had never been before. Not just a program, but a weapon. Thursday arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn evening when the harbor fog rolled in early and the streetlights glowed like islands in a gray sea. Margaret arrived at the station at 6, 3 hours before airtime. Ray was already there, having swept the building for listening devices and positioned himself near the entrance. Beth set up recording equipment to capture everything for her article. Linda sat with a laptop, ready to document calls and prepare formal complaints. Emily and Frank arrived together, both dressed as if attending church. We want to look respectable, Emily explained. People trust respectable. At 8:30, the phone lines lit up. Not with threats this time, but with supporters. Longtime listeners who had heard rumors of trouble and wanted Margaret to know they were listening tonight. A retired teacher. A librarian from 2 towns over. A veteran who remembered Frank from the VFW. Small voices, but enough to fill the dark with light. At 8:50, a car pulled up outside. 3 men in business suits stepped out and approached the entrance. Ray met them at the door, his hand resting casually on his belt where his old service weapon used to hang before retirement. We are with Sycamore Solutions LLC, the lead man said, his smile professional and empty. We understand Mrs. Stone plans to make defamatory statements about private care facilities. We are here to ensure accuracy and protect our business interests. Ray looked at him with the flat stare of someone who had interviewed murderers. This is private property. You are not invited. Leave now or I call the police and report trespassing. The men hesitated, then retreated to their car. They did not leave. They waited. At 9 o'clock, Margaret sat down at the microphone. Her hands were steady now. Fear had burned itself out, leaving only purpose. She took a breath, switched on the transmission light, and began. Good evening. This is Margaret Stone, and you are listening to Twilight Voices. Tonight's program will be different from our usual format. Tonight, I am going to read you a letter." She read the anonymous letter slowly, letting each word land. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She simply read the truth as it had been given to her. When she finished, she looked up at Emily and Frank. They nodded. "That letter arrived 2 weeks ago. Since then, I have learned that the person who wrote it is not alone. Across Grey Haven and towns like it, elderly people are being exploited, stolen from, and silenced. Not by strangers, but by systems we trust. By family members. By churches. By companies that promise care and deliver captivity." The jamming signal started at 9:15. A high-pitched whine that cut through the broadcast, drowning out Margaret's voice. Frank was at the control board in seconds, his carpenter's hands moving across switches and dials with surprising speed. He rerouted the signal through a backup transmitter, something he had insisted on setting up the night before. The whine cut out. Margaret's voice returned. "We are still here," Margaret said calmly. "You cannot silence us that easily." The phone lines exploded. Listeners from across the county calling in with their own stories. A woman whose mother had been placed under guardianship by a court-appointed lawyer who then sold her house. A man whose father's retirement account had been drained by a financial advisor. A nurse from a facility in the next county who had seen residents over-medicated and isolated from family. Beth was transcribing as fast as she could type, her laptop screen filling with testimony. At 9:30, Emily stepped up to the microphone. Margaret yielded her seat. Emily's voice was soft but clear. "My name is Emily Cartwright. I am 73 years old. I was a nurse for 35 years. My son convinced me to sign over my house. I trusted him. I signed. Now I am being evicted from the home my husband and I bought 50 years ago. I am not senile. I am not incompetent. I was just a mother who loved her son. And he used that love as a weapon." Frank spoke next, his gravelly voice carrying decades of work and war. "I am Frank Kowalski. I am 80 years old. I gave $40,000 to a fake church because I was lonely and someone pretended to care. I felt like a fool. I felt ashamed. But I am not the criminal here. The criminal is the man who saw my loneliness and turned it into profit." At 9:45, someone cut the power to the building. The lights went out. The equipment died. For 10 seconds, there was complete darkness and silence. Then the backup generator kicked in, the one Ray had insisted they test 3 times. The lights flickered back. The microphone lived again. "Still here," Margaret said into the darkness. "Still speaking." At 10 o'clock, Linda received an email from Adult Protective Services. Emergency investigation team dispatched to Sycamore Street address. Police escort authorized. Margaret read the email on air. "Tonight, as we speak, investigators are going to the house where people have been held invisible. Because of one letter. Because someone found the courage to ask for help. Because we refused to stay silent." The broadcast ended at 10:30. Margaret signed off with her usual closing. "Thank you for lending me your ears tonight. Remember, your story matters. Your voice matters. You matter." But this time, the words carried different weight. They were not comfort. They were defiance. As Margaret switched off the equipment, Ray came in from outside. The men in suits were gone. The street was quiet. But Ray's phone was buzzing with messages from his old colleagues. The state police are moving. The Attorney General's office is opening an investigation. The FBI is reviewing elder fraud cases in the region. You started something tonight. Something big. Margaret looked at her friends, these ordinary people who had done an extraordinary thing. They had taken their pain and turned it into power. They had refused to be victims. Emily was crying, but smiling. Frank's bruised face looked almost proud. Beth was already drafting her article. Linda was coordinating with protective services. Outside, the fog had lifted. The harbor lay quiet under a field of stars. Somewhere in Grey Haven, elderly people were listening to the recordings, forwarding them to friends, finding courage in the voices they had heard. And in a yellow house on Sycamore Street, investigators were knocking on a door that had been closed too long. Twilight Voices had done what it set out to do. It had made the invisible seen. It had given voice to the voiceless. And it had proven that even the quietest among us could roar. The days after the broadcast moved with the strange momentum of an avalanche. What had been hidden became undeniable. What had been whispered became headline news. Beth's article ran on Friday morning, syndicated to 3 major newspapers by afternoon. State police raid unlicensed elder care facility. 6 residents rescued. By Saturday, television news crews descended on Grey Haven, their satellite trucks crowding the narrow streets. Margaret declined most interview requests. "This is not about me," she told them. "Talk to the people who survived." The house on Sycamore Street yielded 6 elderly residents, all held under fraudulent guardianship agreements. The operation had been running for 3 years, cycling through victims as their assets were drained. The man who ran it, who called himself a care coordinator, was arrested on 18 counts of elder abuse, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. His real name was Dennis Marsh. He had operated similar schemes in Florida and Arizona before coming north. Ray had been right. It was industrial. The anonymous letter writer was among those rescued. Her name was Dorothy Brennan, 79 years old, a former schoolteacher. When Margaret finally met her at the county social services office, Dorothy gripped her hands with surprising strength. "I did not think anyone would listen," Dorothy said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I thought I would die in that room. You gave me my life back." The Twilight Voices broadcast had opened a floodgate. Adult Protective Services received 47 formal complaints in the week following the program. The Attorney General's office launched a task force on elder exploitation. The FBI opened investigations into 3 interstate fraud operations. And most surprisingly, families began to talk. Sons and daughters who had been complicit in their parents' exploitation came forward, some with guilt, some with relief. The silence had been broken, and truth rushed in to fill the void. But not everything resolved neatly. Emily's son Michael hired a lawyer and fought to keep the house. The legal battle would take months, maybe years. Emily moved into a small apartment downtown, her belongings reduced to what fit in a 1-bedroom space. But she was not bitter. "I have my voice," she told Margaret. "He cannot take that. And I am meeting other people like me. We are forming a support group. Survivors of family theft. There are more of us than I imagined." Frank received a settlement from the New Covenant Fellowship after Beth's investigation revealed Pastor Dale's real name was Dale Kincaid. Wanted on fraud charges in 2 states. The money would not replace what Frank lost, but it was something. More importantly, Frank had found purpose again. He began teaching carpentry at the senior center, his workshop filled with elderly men and women learning to build birdhouses and repair furniture. His hands still shook, but they were busy now. That mattered. The Mitchells' case went to court. Their predatory lease agreement was ruled unconscionable, and they regained control of their building. Harold sent Margaret a thank you card with a photo of him and Jean standing in front of their property, Jean in a wheelchair now but smiling. "You saved our legacy," the card read. "Our grandchildren will inherit something after all." Margaret herself became something she never wanted to be, a symbol. People recognized her at the grocery store, thanked her at church, stopped her on the street to share their own stories of exploitation and survival. It was exhausting and humbling in equal measure. She understood now why some heroes retreated from the spotlight. Heroism was not a moment. It was a weight you carried afterward. 3 months after the broadcast, the station board met again. Arthur Wells, who had urged caution before, now spoke with different conviction. "Margaret, we have been discussing the future of Twilight Voices. Donations are up. Sponsorships have returned. But more than that, we have received requests from stations in 6 other states wanting to replicate the program. You have created something important. We want you to continue." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said gently. "It is time for Twilight Voices to belong to someone else. I am 72 years old. I did what needed to be done. But this program should not depend on one person. It needs new voices, younger voices, people who will be here long after I am gone." The board protested, but Margaret was firm. A month later, Twilight Voices was taken over by a collective of 3 younger broadcasters. All under 40, all trained in investigative journalism and elder advocacy. Margaret appeared as a guest on the first new episode, passing the microphone with ceremony and relief. "The program you are listening to belongs to you now," she told the audience. "I was just its caretaker for a while. Now it goes forward without me." Winter came to Greyhaven. The harbor froze at its edges. Snow covered the weathered docks and saltbox houses. Margaret spent her days reading, volunteering at the library again, visiting Dorothy and the other survivors from Sycamore Street. She attended Emily's support group meetings. She had coffee with Frank at Sal's diner. She lived a small life again, and it felt right. On a clear January afternoon, Margaret walked down to the harbor and sat on a bench facing the water. The cold bit at her face, but she did not mind. She thought about the letter, about Dorothy's shaky handwriting, about the courage it took to ask for help when help seemed impossible. She thought about Emily and Frank and all the people who had found their voices because someone finally listened. The harbor bells rang 4 times. A gull cried overhead. The world continued its ordinary rhythms. But Margaret knew now that ordinary could contain extraordinary. That silence could be shattered. That even the smallest voice, amplified with courage, could change everything. She did not have her microphone anymore. She did not need it. The voices she had helped free were speaking for themselves now, echoing across towns and states, a chorus growing louder with each telling. Twilight Voices was not hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who refused to be invisible. Margaret stood, pulled her coat tight, and walked home through the quiet streets of Grey Haven. Behind her, the harbor stretched toward the horizon. Ahead, the town settled into evening. And somewhere, someone was listening, finding courage in the voices that refused to fade. Spring arrived in Grey Haven with the suddenness of revelation. One day the harbor was locked in ice, the next it flowed free, filled with returning boats and the calls of migrating birds. The town emerged from winter changed in ways both visible and invisible. A new community center opened on Maple Street, funded by donations that poured in after the broadcast. Its mission statement, carved in wood above the entrance, read "Every voice matters." Margaret attended the opening ceremony but declined to speak. She stood in the back, watching as Dorothy Brennan cut the ribbon with shaking hands and a steady voice. "This place exists because someone listened," Dorothy said to the crowd of nearly 200 people. "It exists because we refused to disappear. Let it be a reminder that we are never too old to fight back, never too forgotten to matter." The center became a hub almost immediately. 3 mornings a week, Emily's support group met there, now grown to 23 members. They called themselves the Reclaimed, a name Frank had suggested with his usual blunt poetry. They shared resources, legal advice, and most importantly, solidarity. "We are not victims anymore," Emily often said. "We are witnesses teaching others how to see." Frank taught his carpentry classes in the center's workshop every Thursday afternoon. His students ranged from 65 to 92, their hands building everything from bookshelves to wheelchair ramps for homebound neighbors. The work was simple, but its meaning ran deeper. These were people reclaiming agency, building something tangible in a world that had tried to convince them they were obsolete. Twilight Voices continued to broadcast every Thursday night. The new hosts brought fresh energy and sharper investigative skills. They expanded beyond Grey Haven, covering elder exploitation across Maine and into New Hampshire. They won a regional broadcasting award in March. Margaret listened every week from her living room, proud and relieved in equal measure. The program had outgrown her, which meant she had done her job correctly. Beth Torres published a book in April, an investigation into elder fraud networks across New England. She dedicated it to Margaret, Dorothy, Emily, and Frank. "The voices who refused silence," the dedication read. Margaret kept her copy on the coffee table but rarely opened it. She preferred to live forward rather than backward. The legal consequences continued to unfold throughout the spring. Dennis Marsh was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Pastor Dale Kincaid, extradited from Nevada, received 12 years. 3 court-appointed guardians lost their licenses and faced criminal charges. A state senator introduced legislation requiring stricter oversight of guardianship arrangements and elder care facilities. The bill was named Dorothy's Law. When it passed in May, Dorothy attended the signing ceremony at the state capitol, her photograph appearing in newspapers across New England. Michael Cartwright settled with his mother in June. Emily got her house back, along with a formal apology read in court by a judge who made clear his disgust at what had transpired. But Emily did not move back in. She sold the house herself, donated half the proceeds to the community center, and used the rest to buy a small cottage near the harbor. "I do not need a big house anymore," she told Margaret over coffee. "I need a home I chose. That is different." By summer, Grey Haven had become known for something other than its scenic harbor and weathered charm. It was the town where the elderly fought back and won. Tour buses stopped there now, their guides pointing out the community center, the radio station, the bench where Margaret often sat watching the water. She found this attention amusing and slightly absurd. "We did not do anything extraordinary," she insisted to anyone who asked. "We just refused to accept cruelty as normal." But in quieter moments, alone in her house or walking the harbor at dawn, Margaret knew that was not quite true. What they had done was extraordinary precisely because it should have been ordinary. Speaking up should not require courage. Protecting the vulnerable should not be controversial. Listening to the voiceless should not be radical. But in a world that had forgotten these truths, remembering them was a revolutionary act. On a warm evening in late August, Margaret returned to the radio station for the last time. Twilight Voices was hosting a one-year anniversary special, and the new hosts had asked her to make a brief appearance. She sat in the familiar chair, the microphone before her like an old friend. The studio smelled of coffee and dust and possibility. When her moment came, Margaret spoke without notes. "A year ago, I read a letter on this program. It was from someone who felt invisible, someone who believed no one would listen. That letter changed everything, not because of me, but because of what it represented. It represented refusal. Refusal to be silent. Refusal to be forgotten. Refusal to accept that loneliness and age make us disposable." She paused, looking through the glass at the control room, where Frank now volunteered as a board operator, where Emily sat answering phone calls, where Dorothy stood watching with tears in her eyes. "I am not here to tell you what we accomplished," Margaret continued. "I am here to tell you what you can accomplish. Every single person listening has a story that matters. Every single person has a voice that deserves to be heard. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for someone else to speak first. The world will try to make you invisible. Refuse. Always refuse." The broadcast ended to thunderous applause from the small studio audience. Margaret hugged the new hosts, thanked them for carrying forward what she had started, and walked out into the evening. The harbor stretched before her, golden in the sunset. She walked to her favorite bench, the one facing west where she could watch the light change and the boats return home. She thought about the journey from that first letter to this moment. About Dorothy finding freedom. About Emily reclaiming her home. About Frank rebuilding his purpose. About the 47 complaints that became investigations that became convictions that became legislation. About the ripples spreading outward from one act of courage, touching lives she would never know in towns she would never visit. A young woman approached, maybe 30 years old, hesitant but determined. "Mrs. Stone? I just wanted to thank you. My grandmother lives in Ohio. She heard about what happened here. It gave her courage to leave a situation with my uncle that was not good. She is safe now because of you." Margaret smiled gently. "Not because of me. Because of your grandmother's courage. I just had a microphone. She had the bravery to use it." The woman nodded, wiped her eyes, and walked away. Margaret sat alone again, but not lonely. The voices she had helped amplify were everywhere now, a chorus that would continue long after she was gone. That was the point. That was always the point. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The harbor bells rang 6 times. Boats rocked gently at their moorings. Grey Haven settled into evening, this small town that had learned a large lesson about the power of listening, the necessity of courage, and the enduring strength of voices that refused to fade. Margaret Stone sat on her bench and watched the light change, her work complete, her rest earned, her legacy living not in monuments or awards, but in the countless ordinary people who had learned they were extraordinary. The twilight deepened. The first stars appeared. And somewhere, someone found the courage to speak. The voices remained. They would always remain. Every night, somewhere, someone is trapped in silence. Because they grew old. Because they are lonely. Because they were betrayed by someone they trusted. But what this story leaves us is not despair. It's that one letter can change the world. That one person's courage can save dozens. And that even the quietest voice, if someone listens, can shake the foundation of everything. Margaret Stone said, "They tried to make us disappear. Tonight, we make them listen. There may be invisible voices around you too. Listening. That is the most powerful resistance we can offer." I hope this story becomes a small courage for you. And may today be a day when you listen to someone's voice. Twilight voices. The voices of twilight are not over yet. If this story touched your heart, please share these voices with more people through your subscription and likes. See you in the next story.